Good afternoon to our American audience, at least on the East Coast, and good morning to the audience on the West Coast, and good evening to those of you joining from France. I'm Hervé Ferrage from the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the United States. And it is my great pleasure to introduce this last event of our 3 days festival dedicated to the question of freedom of speech, liberté d'expression, which will focus today on race. The festival is co-presented by the French Institute Alliance Française, the New York University, and the French Cultural Services in the United States. A few words about the format. The keynote address by Thomas Chatterton Williams will be followed by a conversation with Nell Irvin painter and Marianne Matard-Bonucci, joining, of course, our keynote speaker, and the talk will be moderated by James McAuley. It will be followed by a Q&A session, and I invite you to post your questions into the chat during the conversation. A few words now about our moderator today and the keynote speaker. James McAuley is a global opinions contributing columnist focusing on French and European politics and culture for the Washington Post. He has reported for the Post since 2016 and has also written for the New York Review of Books. He's the new author of The House of Fragile Things, a book exploring the role of art and culture played in the assimilation and identity of French Jews before World War II. He's currently at work on a biography of Edmond de Rothschild and the early Zionist movement. As for Thomas Chesterton Williams, our keynote speaker today, he's a writer and a journalist. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and a columnist at Harper's, where he launched a letter on justice and open debate signed by 153 public figures denouncing the intolerance of opposing views. He's the author of Losing My Cool and Self-Portrait in Black and White. He's also a 2019 New America Fellow and a visiting fellow at AEI. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hervé, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. It's really meaningful for me to speak with you today about freedom of expression and the preservation of liberal values, in no small part because my own path toward thinking and writing in public began at NYU at the Cultural Reporting and Criticism program at the Graduate Department of Journalism, and then really came into fruition 10 years ago once I moved to France and began to glance back at my own country from a context that was at once similar and foreign. It was an unexpected and welcome treat to have received this invitation and to bring together these two worlds as I try to share a few thoughts about what I believe is at stake at this extraordinarily contentious cultural moment. I'll be speaking mostly about the US and specifically about what is happening in the media environment there. But I think that the implications for France and for Europe more broadly should be clear and will become clearer in the panel conversation to follow. The world of publishing is significantly different now than it was when I was dreaming about breaking into it as an NYU grad student. The economics are different, the demographics are somewhat different, the imagined audience is different, and the role of the written word itself is fundamentally different. All of these changes are relevant to the topic at hand. And so is, I think, my own standpoint. I speak to you as a liberal who is first and foremost aware that an authoritarian, reality-denying political right is the single greatest obstacle to American democracy. I'm the son of a Black man from the segregated South, whose own grandfather was born in the year of the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't deny the resilient flaws in America or in European society, or the potency of bigotry and discrimination. But with that said, what I want to talk to you about today is what I've nonetheless come to see as one of the most significant changes in American, and as it goes, increasingly international cultural life in the past decade. That change, which represents a threat to the vibrancy and long-term health and legitimacy of the mainstream media, if not for now to the bottom line, is what I can only describe as an enforced conformity of thought, even and especially when the thinking in question flies in the face of what the vast majority of audiences know or accept to be an accurate reflection of our shared reality and of ourselves. Two recent examples come to mind. Neither are obscure, but both are emblematic of much broader and more difficult to pin down processes and relations that I think we should all do our best to think through seriously. They affect our cultural and media landscape, and as we've just seen, they affect our politics too. First, on November 4th, when the betting markets were still arriving at the conclusion that Donald Trump's path to victory had narrowed considerably, and leading voices on the left remained hoarse with frustration at the failure of anything resembling a blue wave to swell up and wash the country clean, an eye-opening exchange took place on Twitter. Ruben Gallego, the Democratic congressman and Iraq War veteran from Arizona, tweeted a triumphant message to his supporters: "Arizona Latino vote delivered. This was a 10-year project." He had ample reason to rejoice. For the first time since 1996, the state of Arizona had voted for a Democratic presidential candidate, thanks in large part to strong Hispanic support. This development stood in sharp contrast to outcomes in Texas and Florida, where Latinos delivered crucial votes to Trump, and in California, where they even helped to doom a pro-affirmative action ballot measure. In light of this fragmented result, and much hand-wringing in the media over the question of whether Latinos can still be said to comprise a logically coherent racial category, but interestingly, no such hand-wringing about whether so-called whites or so-called blacks or so-called Asians could comprise stable categories themselves, let alone whether stable racial categories are even possible or desirable. In light of all that, one user, presumably white, responded to the congressman: "Ruben, honest question, how do we as a party improve our work with the Latinx community across the country as well as we've done in Arizona?" Gallego's blunt reply went viral. "First," he said, "start by not using the term Latinx." A prominent cable news personality, who incidentally just hours earlier had referred on air to Justice Clarence Thomas as Uncle Clarence, popped into the thread, dumbstruck, betraying a surprising level of disconnectedness for a professional commentator. "Can you elaborate on this a bit more?" she asked Gallego, with what seemed like genuine incredulity. "I was under the impression that this was the preferred term, and as a Black person, I'm definitely sensitive to what people prefer to be called." In fact, not only is Latinx decidedly not the term most Latinos choose, significant numbers, about 3/4 of the population, have never even heard of it. According to a nationally representative bilingual survey of US Hispanic adults conducted in December 2019 by the Pew Research Center, a mere 3% of Hispanics self-identify with the descriptor. And yet the new gender-neutral pan-ethnic label, Latinx, has emerged as an alternative that is increasingly forced on the population, the report concludes. It is what high-profile politicians, writers, and media personalities insist on using to describe a community they frequently do not belong to, but presume to speak for. Quote, "When Latinx is used, I feel someone is taking away some of my culture," end quote, Gallego answered the cable news anchor's question. Quote, "Instead of trying to understand my culture, they decided to change it to fit their perspective," end quote. The disagreement over and ignorance about such progressive jargon may seem like inside baseball, but it's not frivolous, suggestive as it is of deeper fissures within the always tenuous patchwork of identity groups and economic classes that we need to understand to make our multi-ethnic society function. Progressive, educated, predominantly white members of the left have become ever more removed from the life experiences, perspectives, and desires, not just of the majority of white Americans who vote Republican, but more significantly from large and apparently growing numbers of non-whites too, people whose validation and association they profess to value. Significantly, the battle over Latinx might be understood as one more instance of, quote, intra-white status jockeying, end quote, as Rehan Salam has observed elsewhere, an opportunity for those who see themselves as, for lack of a better term, upper whites to disaffiliate themselves from those they've deemed lower whites. What Gallego knows and can't help but bristle at is the fact that such semantic gatekeeping ultimately is not even about the real world community it professes to concern itself with. Such misreading or dismissal of the complexity of minority perspectives and interests is not only insensitive, but dangerous. It can lead us to advocate ill-conceived, poorly articulated policies that backfire to the benefit of the right, or worse, inflict actual harm on vulnerable communities. Consider the recent push to defund the police. Those calling to do so have shown a complete disregard for the voices and perspectives of many members of the African American community. Nakima Levy-Armstrong, a civil rights lawyer who formerly led the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP, told the Star Tribune in July, after the city council voted to defund the police in the wake of George Floyd's killing. Quote, "We have not been consulted as the city makes its decisions, even though our community is one of the most heavily impacted by both police violence and community violence," she said, end quote. The tragic reality she alluded to, of course, is that after Floyd's death last May, homicides in Minneapolis increased by 50%. More than 500 people had been shot by December, the most in a decade and a half. Like the niche semantic preference for Latinx, but with far more direct and dire consequences, viral slogans which take on the weight of moral purity tests, such as defund or abolish the police, created by people of color perhaps, but powerfully amplified by whites situated at a considerable remove, have been foisted on Black communities that have a far more equivocal relationship with policing than is often acknowledged. Enforced consensus, like restrictions on speech, whether explicit or implicit, deprives us of a textured understanding of the real world we must inhabit. Last February, whites on the left expressed shock and disappointment when Joe Biden beat the surging Bernie Sanders in the South Carolina primary, due in large part to moderate and conservative Black primary voters who chose to reject the socialism they'd been told was in their best interest. Why should this have been surprising? Again, according to widely publicized research also conducted by Pew, Black Americans' self-reported ideology has remained relatively stable throughout the 21st century. In 2019, about 40% of Black Democratic voters considered themselves moderate, while an additional 25% identified as conservative. Just 29% of Black Democrats described their views as liberal. Yet these glimpses into the heterogeneity of Black and Latino, to say nothing of Asian, political preferences did not prepare influential progressives for the far less welcome November revelation that Donald Trump, whose behavior and associations have rightly earned him the reputation of a kleptocratic xenophobe, if not an outright fascist, had gained traction with every major demographic, including even Muslim voters, despite his travel ban. In a year of inescapable talk of racial identity and white supremacy, and mass protests against systemic and interpersonal racism during the height of a global pandemic, the extraordinary irony was that one of the very few groups whose support for Trump declined even modestly was white males. In fact, many Americans of all ethnic, religious, and sexual categories, from Tea Party whites who despise the Obamacare they've come to depend on, to Latinos and Asians of immigrant backgrounds who support a strong man who scapegoats foreigners as parasitic invaders, are united by one trait in particular. They don't want to see themselves as hapless victims who must be patronized and shielded from harmful views, as well as higher caste oppressors and invisible systemic forces. In my own experience, whenever I've tried to make the point that racial groups are not and cannot possibly be monolithic, I've been accused, often by white progressives, of the equivalent of false consciousness, or a delegitimizing proximity to whiteness. In other words, of having lost touch with authentic marginalized reality. But if any of that is true, then it is also the case that there are significant numbers of Black, Latino, Asian, and also gay and lesbian voters who have lost touch right alongside me. And so one question that I really want to billboard today is this, and it's inextricably linked to any serious discussion of freedom of expression and so-called cancel culture. When we say we care about diversity, what do we really mean by that? Do we mean effectively that the same increasingly limited slate of views must be expressed by increasingly phenotypically varied speakers? Do we mean that there are specific ideas certain identity categories are obligated to embrace? Do we really want to live in a world where Joe Biden can say, "You ain't Black" to anyone who doesn't vote as they're expected to do? A world in which Pete Buttigieg can be mockingly dismissed as a heterosexual gay man? Or do we actually want to deal with diverging and competing perspectives, even errors made in search of truth, not empty trolling or bad faith argument for the sake of it, but genuine, honest disagreement? And are we interested at all in the perspectives of those minorities within the minority, the ex-Muslim or even the practicing Muslim with a critique of Islam, the young white woman who is concerned about due process in the era of Me Too, the Black Ivy League professor who raises a skeptical eyebrow at the new anti-racist dogma? Are these not authentic points of view that need to be encountered? Here we might also consider the deep irony that the new American orthodoxy around sensitivity to a particular notion of diversity is having the paradoxical effect of flattening differences elsewhere in the world. I'm specifically thinking of the way in which traditional and social media has begun to interpret events in France. Last fall, America, in the age of George Floyd and Donald Trump, fully turned its gaze inward, no longer seeming to have the stamina or the desire to interpret events elsewhere on their own terms. There was, of course, simmering guilt over the very real legacy of slavery and systemic racism, as well as contemporary police brutality. This was combined with an evolving elite consensus, often well-meaning, but just as often imaginatively lacking, around a new and totalizing racial binary. At one pole, there is monolithic whiteness, in which diverse peoples comprising Jews, WASPs, Catholics of divergent European descent, and when it is narratively convenient, as it was with the Lebanese shooter in Boulder, Colorado this past March, Arabs, or in the case of Enrique Tarrio, the Afro-Cuban Proud Boys leader, white adjacent Latinos and Asians, and various other multicultural white non-whites. At the other pole, there is generic non-whiteness, which comprises the vast bulk of humanity, or so-called people of color. Seemingly overnight, there was a new and pronounced reluctance in the mainstream press and agenda-setting Twitter to view what was happening in France, namely a spree of gruesome machete cuttings, full decapitations, and stabbings from Paris down to the Riviera, through the lens of agency and ideology, radical religion, terrorism, or even simple good and evil. Suddenly, it was about identity categories and invisible but omnipresent systems of oppression. The French as an ethnicity, and in direct contradiction to their own hard-won self-definition, were now synonymous with white, and the Islamists and their sympathizers, even those from Eastern Europe, reinterpreted as POC. After all, they had been racialized in a white supremacist society that couched its methods of domination in hollow Enlightenment ideals and deceptive appeals to universalism. In the fresh light of the American racial reckoning, fanatically secular France had, from a certain increasingly compelling angle, brought this grief upon itself. Why didn't they just stop publishing and teaching those awful cartoons anyway? An eyebrow-raising headline in the New York Times encapsulated this new attitude of reproach. Following the monstrous beheading of Samuel Paty, the first analysis of the attack read simply, "French police shoot and kill man after fatal knife attack on the street." Adam Nosseter, then the paper's Paris bureau chief, described the victim as having, quote, incited anger, end quote, among his Muslim students. The implication, echoed throughout the American press in stark contrast to the events of 2015, was unambiguous. It was as if the very act of teaching the universal value of free speech to all students, regardless of ethnic affiliation, was what had really led to Paty's murder. The soft anti-racist bigotry here being, of course, the unstated assumption that Muslims could not be expected to understand satire or handle free expression. This in turn seemed to exculpate Paty's assassin, an 18-year-old Chechen asylum recipient with deranged and extremist beliefs who had brutally hunted down his victim only after learning of him through a reckless and misinformed outrage mob on Twitter. It was painful for many French people of all ethnicities and religious affiliations to read such coverage. For months, the perceived abandonment of an admired ally became the subject of constant conversation in the French media and in living rooms. After all, was it not the Islamists who just 5 years earlier had left hundreds, including many non-whites and some Muslims, dead in the streets, and many thousands more with lifelong trauma? Was it not the adherents of a radical ideology and not some abstract identity group or color category who had made it necessary for the poor teacher to organize a lesson around the principles of civil liberty in the first place? Why had the world's English language paper of record framed this act of barbarism in the logic of a simple, and the insinuation being possibly excessive, police shooting? Worse, why were journalists at other outlets suddenly invested in pushing a narrative that would reduce complex issues of secularism, republicanism, and immigration into the blunt catch-all of whiteness? After all, it's not as though significant numbers of African and Arab descended French citizens were not also vocally appalled by such violence. More troubling still, when there were not historical and systemic abuses to point to as justification for the unjustifiable, why were some journalists willing to go so far as to fabricate them out of thin air, as Karen Ataya, the Washington Post's global opinions editor, did when she tweeted to her more than 200,000 followers, "Non-white French people have been sounding the alarm on Macron for years, but the global media wanted to anoint him as a centrist saint, the person who saved France from Marine Le Pen. Now he wants to give Muslim kids ID numbers to go to school," end quote. What was that about? Such an inflammatory and baseless accusation, suggesting nothing less than a new Holocaust in the making, circulated all the way to Pakistan, where that country's Minister of Human Rights promptly retweeted it, potentially stoking further violence in the real world. In the past year, then, there has been a powerful shift in American media to reframe even foreign stories through an overarching and specifically American understanding of free speech and identity. It is a discourse that has been growing all over Europe and is starting to alter the way Europeans themselves must regard their own societies, perhaps most visibly in the recent controversies in the Netherlands, Spain, and other territories over the identity of the translators of Amanda Gorman's best-selling poetry. France has emerged as a pivotal theater of resistance to this new American orthodoxy, with President Macron a forceful and vocal opponent, insisting that his country has its own culture and way of achieving a multi-ethnic democracy, and will not be well served by mimicking the American model. But he cannot refuse it on his own or by fiat. And so this is an issue that will require careful thought and action from all of us. Since 4 other writers and I published a letter on justice and open debate in Harper's Magazine back in July, arguing that a censorious climate was threatening our society's media, cultural, corporate, and academic institutions, I continue to receive emails and messages of concurrence and support from the US and from many other countries almost every day. There's a sense among many liberals of different backgrounds and age ranges that what is called cancel culture is real and that we are no longer fully at home in the institutions we so revere. There is a sense that a concerning number of these institutions have signaled that they will not fight to keep us there, won't even acknowledge the severity of the threat we are now facing. If I'm completely honest with you, which I hope you want me to be, my fear is that anyone who is heterodox, skeptical, contrarian, open to opposing views, tolerant and even interested in testing her own assumptions against different and uncomfortable responses, anyone who is willing to say, for instance, that interdictions against blasphemy have no place in a liberal democracy, and that even offensive views must be safeguarded. My fear is that she is going to be more and more homeless in the mainstream non-conservative institutions. And in the highly public way we write and think and live today, everyone else coming up behind her will see what has happened to her and will take notice. It is this chilling onlooker effect that most concerns me, and the capacity it has to foster an atmosphere in which people take implicit cues and don't dare to be perceived as having gotten out of line. This is a stifling environment in which to work. It's a dangerous environment in which to think. Free thinking is not harmful to disadvantaged groups. A group of 100 Spanish language intellectuals, including the Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa, put it in an open letter in support of the Harper's letter. On the contrary, we believe it is emancipatory, and censorship, however well-intentioned it may want to present itself, is counterproductive, end quote. This is a position that has unfortunately become extremely controversial today. The cynical co-optation of genuine concern over so-called cancel culture by the right and by elected officials on all sides, as well as those who simply wish to avoid accountability for wrongdoing of any kind, has certainly muddied the debate. This is a serious problem, but the right is not where prestige is, and the right does not set the conversation that matters. I take as self-evident that we all agree on the enormous failings that allowed America to put Donald Trump in charge. And I take for granted that we're all too aware that these tendencies have not disappeared with the election of Joe Biden, though I hope that moderation will dampen them. The illiberal authoritarian threat from the right is the greater evil. But the threat from the left is at the level where prestige and legitimacy and expertise and even the very perception of goodness all meet. It is a very serious and intricate situation to attempt to understand. Everything in my own experience as a writer and as someone who has navigated the color line and the class line from more than one position has made increasingly clear to me that so many of the most important and influential and prestigious institutions and publications have become captive to a false consensus, an illusion made startlingly compelling through the funhouse mirror of social media, but an illusion nonetheless, and a dangerous one at that. The truth is that if certain viewpoints cannot be responsibly edited and published in a rigorous and thoughtful way, that hurts everyone, and it diminishes the total media ecosystem. Because those viewpoints do not just go away or necessarily draw less attention or become less persuasive, they simply get expressed through far less responsible channels. Culture is not politics by other means, and we are impoverished when we allow ourselves to be pressured into accepting that it is or that it should be. That is what the fascists and the communists made it. That is what liberalism at its best is singularly capable of guarding against. It's possible to be outraged and a soldier in the war for justice, inclusion, and equality and still not believe the problem requires restricting even offensive speech and maintaining a stifling consensus. Conformity of thought can be as diminishing as exclusion, perhaps even more so. Finally, what we call wokeness, like cancel culture, I hate the term, but I don't know of a better one, has itself become a new establishment. It is not radical. It is in fact a novel way of gatekeeping for the very few who understand the evolving codes. Worse, it centralizes race in a way that mirrors the obsessions and oversimplifications of actual racists. Instead of seeking to transcend abstract differences of ancestry, it solidifies them in ways that contradict generations of liberal argument and progress. On a practical level, insofar as it can be profoundly unrepresentative of the complexity of actual minority and also mainstream experiences, it ends up doing a genuine disservice to a public trying to understand their own fluctuating society. For the past 2 election cycles, we have been twice shocked by results that defy official narratives and wisdom. Yielding coverage of racial and social issues to those who would restrict these topics to a single lens, even an ostensibly well-meaning one, ends up undermining the very project of journalism and public thinking in general. No matter how well-meaning the intent, we are all fundamentally left with an unrepresentative and inaccurate portrait of the world, which we can no longer afford if we ever could. I have to believe that we can strike a fair and inclusive and maximally tolerant balance that will serve all of us better going forward. For it is no victory at all to become less free in a seemingly more equitable manner. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Thomas, for those remarks. You've certainly given us a lot to chew on in our discussion to come. So I just wanted to say, just from my own part, that it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here with our amazing speakers, and just to briefly introduce the other panelists with us here today. We have Nell Irvin Painter, the American historian, writer, and visual artist. And we also have Marianne Matard-Bonucci, who is a professor of contemporary history at the University of Paris 8, and who is a specialist on Italian fascism and anti-Semitism. We no doubt have a lot to discuss, and I thought we might start with some remarks that Nell has prepared on similar topics. So I might hand or I was going to say hand the microphone, but there is no microphone. Nell, perhaps you can come in with your comments now.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Thomas. I should say, really, thank you, Thomas. I actually prepared my remarks because there were so many things I wanted to say, and I feared if I spoke spontaneously, I'd be scattered all around the place. In some aspects, I disagree with Thomas. But I end on a note that very much agrees with him. Many months have passed since I signed what has become known as the Harper's Letter. And if asked to join such a statement today, I would decline. In these few months, the term cancel culture has come to the fore as an emblem of the right, supplying the theme to an entire Trumpy meeting of Republicans and crocodile tears by the bucketful over free speech. In this climate, anecdotal incidents of abuse, success, and stupidity have overshadowed more fundamental heedlessness to systemic abuses of human rights. I do not mean to say that anecdotal incidents of abuse, success, and stupidity should not be addressed. They should be. And that is what the legal process is for. But anecdotal incidents should not draw attention away from institutional racism and sexism, which continue to exist in both the US and France. Better not to deflect concerns for fundamental abuses of human rights with a phrase that now summons up right-wing pettishness. As a historian, I'm well aware of what has historically been disregarded in both the USA and France. In the US, it's the history of people of African descent and of women of all races and ethnicities. In France, it's the meaning of empire, meanings that are financial and demographic as well as political. James Macaulay mentions the unseen whiteness of the Enlightenment, which certainly merits attention and which I address in my book, The History of White People, and its French edition, Histoire des Blancs. The very terms and concepts we employ when we talk about race are rooted in a racialized enlightenment that needs to be seen. Kant, for instance, figures in every discussion of Western thought, but his views of peoples of the world need also to be known. In Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime, Kant put forward the idea of Persians and Turks as ugly people and recommended their marrying women from the Caucasus. In terms of contemporary life, French attention to Black Lives Matter gratifies me immensely, for the scourge of police brutality inflects both societies. I see from the news that the Chauvin decision in Minneapolis may inspire serious investigation into police brutality in France and further direct attention to the ways in which Blackness magnifies police brutality. I doubt the cases of Adama Traoré, Michel Zelcler, and Cédric Chauviat would have reached French national consciousness without the massive George Floyd protests last year in the USA. Assa Traoré, Adama's older sister, said in this regard, "This fight is no longer just the fight of the Traoré family. It's everyone's struggle. We are fighting for our brother in the US, George Floyd, and for Adama." I hope one long-running feature of American taxonomy will not be adopted in France, and that is demographic statistics kept by race, not currently legal in France. True, racial statistics would initially make it easier to spot racial discrimination, which does exist, but racial statistics would open the Pandora's box of racial classification, as Thomas Chatterton mentions, the Pandora's box of racial classification of who counts as what. The official encoding of the racialization of French society would, I fear, invite in Americans' preoccupation with race. Better to craft remedies that foster diversity, inclusion, and access, rather than to obsess over definitions of race. Remedies are better than racial taxonomy.
Thank you very much, Nell. And Marianne, perhaps you would like to respond as well before I ask the group some questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy to participate to this debate, and I'm sorry because my English is not as good as I would like it to be, but
not at all. It's much better than my French, I promise you.
Okay, so it was very interesting for me to hear Thomas and Nell, and I agree with a lot of things they said. About the first question we prepared, I don't know, I begin to speak about that or not? No.
Sure. I feel like, you know, I'm not sure exactly which question you are referring to, but essentially, if you have just sort of any kind of reaction to either what Nell or what Thomas said in his remarks.
Yes, no, I think one thing important is that the contexts are very different in France and the United States, and it's not possible to analyze the French context with keys, with concepts that are born in the United States, you know. This is the first point.
Well, could you say more about that? Could you say what?
I have prepared something too about the ethnic statistic, but I think if we respect, you know, the plan, because for me it's easier to respect this plan, I will say things about that after.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, well, so why don't we pick up where we left off at the end of Nell's remarks. So Nell, I was very struck by what you were saying about how at the end of the day, it's very touching and inspiring to see that the Black Lives Matter movement reverberated around the world, and especially in France with the case of Adama Traoré and others, but that ultimately we need to find other remedies for fighting and dismantling systemic oppression, racial injustice than something like ethnic statistics in the sort of French universalist context. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. I mean, I just, as somebody who's reported in France and many times on this topic in the last 5 years, one thing that I hear often from Assa Traoré herself, who I've spoken to several times, and many others on the sort of activist side of things, is that the French, how to put it, the universalist construction, which is to essentially to look beyond the racial differences that, you know, that might divide us all toward the sort of citizen collective, that essentially creates a landscape in which we don't always have the language to describe disparities and discrimination that does exist. And so the statistics could be seen as a tool for fighting all of that. So, I mean, I guess when you say remedies, I'm rambling, but what kind of remedies do you see being feasible, if not data?
Well, one remedy or two remedies already in play in France are affirmative action. What is it called in France?
It's called discrimination positive.
Positive, yeah.
Which is a whole other, right, yeah.
Yeah, which takes into account where people live, what schools they went to, a lot of different categories in addition to the clunky category of race. And in this sense, I'm completely in agreement with Thomas about how we get caught up in names and definitions. If I were running the world in the United States, remedies would be according to family wealth. And that, if I were running France, that's one way I would craft remedies, family wealth. So that would bring in a lot of people in the banlieue, but also in the rural areas that have been hollowed out. The concerns that the Gilets jaunes brought. So all of that can be taken together, I think, with an emphasis on remedies rather than on classification.
Thomas, do you have any thoughts on that? What is your could you say more, perhaps? I mean, I've heard you say this before, but you know, your feeling about the danger, so to speak, of tools like data about the number of people from a certain ethnic group, that, in your view, if I've understood correctly, sort of reifies the categories that divide us. But do you, I don't know, do you look at France today and see a society that is doing as much as it can to fight systemic injustice, and it is systemic in many cases?
Well, that's a that's a question that, first of all, I want to thank Nell for her remarks, and also for her really powerfully intelligent and insightful book, A History of White People, which really helped me in writing my last book. But to your question, no, France isn't doing everything it can to fight systemic injustice, but no society that I am aware of is. All human societies have xenophobia, racism, what have bigotry, prejudice. But where my concern is not that France has a perfect model and America has a flawed model. It's that in any of these societies, I don't believe that we're ever going to transcend racism so long as we continue to buy into and reify the categories of race that actually that actually feed on it and that continue it in our societies. So if we're saying that there's no such thing biologically as white and black and everything in between, there's no racial difference. But then we continue to live our lives through racecraft, as the Field Sisters ingeniously termed it. And to make this concept real by practice, then we're going to actually continue to have the same problems as if we lived in a world with actual distinct human races and all of the inequalities that implies. So of course I'm aware of the fact that you need to understand that there are more people of Arab and African descent in French prisons, and right now we just say that there are French citizens in French prisons, and that's an inadequate way of understanding the texture of reality that's going on. But by buying into and importing ideas of racial difference into the society, I'm not sure that that's going to solve what's wrong.
And I guess I don't know, there's so much here that's fascinating. I know for those of us who spend time on both sides of the ocean, and you know, it's just it's such a rich topic area. One thing, you know, when we talk about one thing, I, as an American who lives in France myself, that I'm very interested in hearing from French friends and others is that race is like identity politics, as we talk about it, is a somewhat American invention that is imposed on France. And there's been lots said about that. And that, you know, France's context as a universal republic demands a specific knowledge of a different tradition, which is of course true. But I was wondering if we could go back for a minute to Nell's remarks about the few lines that Nell, that you said about Kant and about the Enlightenment and about just what it meant when these conceptions of Enlightenment universalism, which is still very much the French ideal, emerged. And you know, the thought in France today that I hear all the time is that it's the Americans who are obsessed with race because of their history of slavery, which certainly has some truth to it. No one could deny that. But that in France, it's sort of it's an attempt to transcend all of these realities. So I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more? I mean, to what extent can we say that universalism is not informed by some concept of racial difference?
Well, we need more than racial difference. So a lot of the taxonomy of the late 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries had to do with head shape and had to do with how much gunshot you could fit in a skull of various people. So the idea of ranking people by their bodies is one that comes out of the Enlightenment, and it feeds into racism, of course. But what I would like us to remember is that the Enlightenment, let's say the second half of the 18th century, was a moment of the transatlantic slave trade and Europeans talking a lot about the justice or injustice of enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
And so the politics of the time and the culture of the time is more than simply measuring bodies. And the context infiltrated what people took as the meaning of measuring bodies. So I would like a larger understanding of what was in the air of people like Blumenbach and so forth. Blumenbach is a good guy in my mind, but there are lots of other people who let what we would call racist ideas permeate their science. So over and over again, we hear about the Enlightenment as the moment of universalism, but it is also the moment of the encoding of racism and racial difference. We need a larger understanding of the meanings of the Enlightenment.
That's very interesting. Marianne, I wonder if now, I mean, I'd be curious to hear, we've been talking a lot, all of us sort of with American eyes in some regard about France. I'd be very curious to hear from you a French perspective on what's going on in America, vis-a-vis identity politics, vis-a-vis the discussion about race. How do you see what's happening there, and what there being the United States, and what do you think Americans get wrong about France?
Yes, so there was an important echo, of the movement Black Lives Matter in France, but more that Black Lives Matter, it was the death of George Floyd, which was very important, which had a great audience. And one thing I would like to highlight is that the chronology of anti-racism and racism is not the same in France and in the United States. In France, more than Black Lives Matter, the riots of 2005 were very important recently, because I remember that those riots were provoked by the death by electrocution of Bouna Traoré and Ziad Benna, people who were overtaken by the police. And for 3 weeks, there were some riots in France, riots which led to awareness of the difficulties and even the failure of the French model of integration for minorities of immigrant origin. And this moment of 2005 was very important. But I would like to remember another thing, is that when Black Lives Matter begins in the States, the real emergency in France was anti-Semitism. I have to remember that in the 2014, for the first time since the 30s, an anti-Semitic demonstration called Jour de colère, Day of Rage, took place in the street of Paris with slogans like Jews out of France, And since 2006, 11 people in France were killed because they were Jewish, including children and old women.
Yes.
But it's important, because racism in France is anti-Semitism. It's a part important, in the way in which we appreciate those questions. And here appears first difficulty, because when those people were killed, this anti-Semitism did not mobilize as much against it as one could have imagined. Why? Because Jewish people are a socially integrated minority, and there is a difficulty to consider ethnic hostilities if they are not correlated to social discrimination. We have this problem. I don't know if it's the same thing in the United States. And the second reason is that the authors of these attacks are radicalized Islamic Muslims. The Muslim minority in France is victim of racism and discrimination. And there is a reluctance of some traditionally anti-racist circles of the left to denounce this anti-Semitism for fear of stigmatize these populations.
Yes,
So,
and I should just interject very briefly to say to remind all of our viewers and listeners today that in Paris and across France there are major demonstrations today precisely in the name of one of the victims that Marianne is mentioning, Sarah Halimi, who in 2017 was brutally murdered and defenestrated from her apartment in the 11th arrondissement of Paris. And the nation's highest appellate court declined to declined to prosecute the author of the attack and let him sort of go off because of he was on drugs at the time that he committed the attack. So it's a big issue, and I'm glad that you brought that up. It's sort of in the headlines even this very day. So anyway, please continue.
No, and another thing I wanted to say is that even if we don't have ethnic statistics, as in the United States, we have a lot of tools to measure those manifestations of racism. And for example, we have many institutions in France that independent or state institutions that are here to observe and to fight, against racism and anti-Semitism. And I don't know, but we, to summarize, we can observe that the prejudice are, if we see the history of prejudice, we can see that the minorities are more and more accepted, even there is a very important racism in France. Discrimination exists, and for example, in 2019, there was specific report about Black population in France from la Commission nationale consultative des droits de l'homme that show that Blacks are the most discriminated of the minorities when, for example, they are looking for a job or housing. Blacks are victims of insistent prejudice inherited from slavery and the colonial period. Racist insults still frequently appear in sports stadiums, for example, or on social networks. So this is a reality. And the question is how to fight against this reality and those reality, because there is this racism with the Black people, but with the Muslims too. The most important is with the Roma, population.
Yes, of course.
And we have this anti-Semitism, very important. And in respect to the population, to the importance of the population, Jewish people are the more victims or violence, verbal or physical violence, So the tableau, the panorama is very complex and maybe more complex. I don't know, because I know more the French situation, but maybe more complex if we compare to the American situation, in which there is this separation between Black and white people, you know. And I think it's important to remember that, because some recent anti-racist organizations have tried to import in France some concepts and some strategies which were born in the American context. And
could you be specific? Like, what kind of concepts and terminology are we talking about?
Yes, sure. For example, the idea of state racism. And for us, state racism is the political of Vichy, of le régime de Vichy, l'État français, against Jewish people, is a political in which the state, the government, take laws to discriminate population. So in democratic state which have laws to repress, you know, racism, it's impossible to say we have state racism.
So that's if I may, that's a really interesting example. So I mean, I have followed that debate myself a lot in the last couple of years, and it's been a huge part of the public conversation in France. But I think, you know, of course, there is the resonance of Vichy, which for many French participants in the debate is impossible to get beyond. But I think, you know, if we listen honestly to what some of the anti-racist activists are saying, it's things like the contrôle d'identité, and it's things like the police checks of people, and like, you know, the French government's own civil liberties ombudsman Jacques Toubon has revealed in a study last year that, you know, something like Black and Arab men get stopped by police who are agents of the state, right? 20 times higher than than white men. And so it's things like that that people are trying to articulate. And I just, from my perspective, I agree that, you know, the term might be maladroit or imprecise, but what I find a little striking in the French context sometimes is that, you know, so the terms are thrown out because of some historical significance, but then what is left to describe this phenomenon without that term?
No, but it's true, you know, that those contrôles aux faciès, as we say in French, exist. They are, we have studies about that. You mentioned le défenseur des droits de l'homme, but I have to remember that le défenseur des droits de l'homme is an independent institution created by the state. So it's not possible to say, you know, we have institutions who have link with the states, which denounce, you know, those kind of practices as contrôle aux faciès, for example. So it's complicated. Recently, and I wanted to say that too, I think the death of George Floyd has contributed to the rebound of the anti-racist struggle. And militant associations have taken up the case of George Floyd. For example, the supporters of the Traoré family, who advance their cause and to denounce, you know, the violence of the police. And the question of racism within the police force and the problem of police violence was put this year on the public agenda with force. And this is really new, because before there was a real denial of the politics about that, you know.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw, if you live in France, but there was a parliamentary mission of information on the emergence and evolution of the different forms of racism. And in this report, you can find it online, the report rejects the idea of an institutional racism within the police, but admits that certain acts, such as facial checks, can we say that, are not sufficiently framed by the law and by the top of the police. And there was a real debate, you know, in the media and in this commission about that. And the problem that has emerged is not, is that the problem in France is less that of police racism. There is racism in police, you know, it's different. And it's more the violence of the police. And we can, see, for example, the studies of Fabien Jobard, who speaks of the progressive phenomenon of militarization of the police, understaffed in the post-Algerian war period. So around this question of, and about this violence, Nell gave the name of Cédric Chouviat, but Cédric Chouviat is white. It's not black, for example. And so, you know, it's interesting because the debate shows that the problem, there is racism in the police, as there is racism in the French society. But the problem, many more important, is this question of the way in which police manage with brutality and with violence.
Okay, that's you've given, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Something, you know, in terms of police brutality, which has been a long-running concern of African Americans, and you know, police brutality has triggered massive demonstrations called riots throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. The Black Panther Party was organized around combating police brutality in the 1960s. So it's a long-running issue. It's a long-running Black issue. However, the police in the United States kill 1,000 people a year. Now, overwhelmingly, that is disproportionately, those are Black and brown people, Black and brown men. However, hundreds of other Americans. So I agree with Marianne completely that the larger question is of police brutality.
That's a very important distinction to keep in mind. I was wondering if I could, we could return briefly to the question of freedom of expression along these lines, sort of in keeping with what you and Thomas said at the beginning. I might ask Thomas first a question, which is, so Thomas, after you organized the Harper's letter that sort of went viral over the summer, it really reverberated in France, especially. I know that, you know, elsewhere in the world, it was sort of picked up and discussed, but very much in France, it got a lot of support and a lot of traction. And I wonder if you could kind of reflect a little bit for us about why that is. And, you know, I have some thoughts myself. I mean, I think that, you know, we're living in a country where, you know, 5 years ago, journalists were shot and killed for having been part of a publication that depicted pictures of the Prophet Muhammad. A few months ago, a school teacher was publicly beheaded in broad daylight for having shown said caricatures to his students. So I think that, you know, in France, the issue of free expression is obviously, it has become in the public mind a matter of life and death. But I mean, do you think that that's what caused your letter to be so resonant with people, or was it something else, or was it also a mix of other factors? I'd just be curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and an interesting one that I've tried to think about too, because in many ways, France is a society in which it's a lot less free to speak than America is. I mean,
yes, they have hate speech laws.
You can have a criminal, offense for speech in France in a way that.
And one thing that, I mean, strikes Americans like me is like how often so many public figures are constantly suing each other for
libel laws and things
rule.
like this. Yeah. So in many ways, France is a much more restrictive speech environment. But I do think that, you know, they have a fundamental, it seems to be much more mainstream in French society right now that you really can't give up things like the right to offend. You can't give up things like, you know, a couple of years ago, the New York Times unilaterally, categorically stopped publishing all cartoons because one cartoon was deemed anti-Semitic, picked up on their, you know, on this syndicated network. They don't publish cartoons anymore. And I think, you know, that's a kind of, that's a way of giving in, of changing, of sacrificing something, the art of satire, or the tradition of satire, that I think the French are really adamant about not losing. I also think that the French regard the United States probably more passionately and more focusedly than most other cultures do. They pay quite a lot of attention to debates we have, especially intellectual debates. And, you know, I think that there's a hyper awareness and a sensitivity that some of the things they see from their perspective going wrong in the US are coming over to this side of the Atlantic inevitably.
And on that note, because I was going to say, my next question was, you know, it's not just the free speech fight. It's also about like
the cultural imperialism, the soft power. Oh yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure I would call it that, but fine. I think it's also about, you know, opposing what we see or what is called wokeness, and I think we all agree that it's a silly term. But in fact, like whatever we mean by that. But in France, you know, the notion of essentialized identity categories of voices defined in that sense and not by any other sense. And anyway, there's so much resistance to that right now. But I have to wonder as well, you know, that there's a certain intellectual honesty to that in some regard, like given the French model. But then you look at sort of where we have been in the last year in the world of letters in France, and you know, things like these horrible exposés about, and this is not true in just France, but it's true elsewhere in the US and elsewhere, but you know, these revelations about this sort of ossified intellectual elite that is more or less homogenous in terms of not only its sort of racial composure, but its cultural education, its kind of a background and all of that, and just like what has been covered up. And here I'm referring to things like the Gabriel Matzneff scandal, and the list goes on, more recently with Olivier Duhamel. And I wonder, I mean, do you think that there's some degree to which the opposition to woke, so-called woke American mores is a means of kind of defending the citadel from accountability in some way?
Sure. I mean, that's a serious question. There's a couple of things. I wanted to say, you know, it's kind of funny to say cultural imperialism, but I do think that actually a significant part of this is that when we talk about what's happened, what has changed, certainly the Western world so much in the past decade or more, it's the rise of smartphones, the rise, you know, the internet becoming fully integrated into all our lives. And it's these American tech companies, social media has become the lingua franca of the Western world, at the same time that the lingua franca of social media is the language of social justice. And so it's not just that social media speaks English, it speaks a specific kind of English. And it feels like a framework and a lens of looking at society that's imposed on the French from an American position of cultural power and dominance. So I think there is a justifiable kind of reaction to that that's not completely unrelated to the reaction against McDonald's and Starbucks and all of these things. I think that those things do go together. It is kind of cultural dominance that the French, you know, that they cringe at. On top of that, yes, I do think that in any society, you know, oftentimes what I find so frustrating about the language of race is that oftentimes we use racial language to talk about class language. And in France, when you're talking about people in positions of power, when you're talking about connected people, people with generations of wealth, sure, a lot of those people tend to be white, but they tend to be a specific kind of white person that has always been in a dominant position. And when you're talking about people of color, they tend to be immigrants and people that have more recently arrived, the descendants of immigrants who are necessarily not in those long-standing networks. And so we kind of lose sight of some of the class dynamics that I think are very...
Right. But don't you think the woke, the so-called woke movement is particularly threatening to that sort of ossified elite for any number of reasons?
Absolutely, it's threatening, but it's not necessarily threatening to them insofar as they're white or deemed white in a racial framework. It's threatening to them as it's threatening to any elites. And the language of wokeness also doesn't benefit most poor Black and brown people. It's something that's a kind of gatekeeping language that benefits a kind of elite minority.
I don't disagree. I just think like my interest is like why France is so interested in fighting this sort of perhaps, I mean, this their conception of American wokeness.
Wait. Who is France here?
That's a good question. But I mean, that's an excellent question. But I think, you know, the president of the French Republic has spoken out against these ideas. Okay. There was the deputy education minister who has launched a public kind of crusade against so-called Islamo-leftism in French universities. I mean, it's the mainstream opinion among kind of prominent columnists.
But if you had looked at the United States before the election of last November, you could have said the same thing about the president of the United States and prominent
right. And in fact,
and you wouldn't say those are the United States, those are America. You
well,
that,
perhaps, but I think that when we're talking about the actions of a government, it is legitimate to say so.
No, it would have been the government in 2020. It would have been the government. No, I won't belabor this, but my question is on the table is just who is France?
Right, and that's a really good point because there is, as is everywhere, a huge diversity of opinion. But you know, if you read I would say the main kind of French newspapers and kind of listen to politicians when they're on TV, this is the kind of consensus opinion that wokeness, a la the United States, is something to be fought. And I'm very interested in why that is the case. And I mean, I think Thomas has done a really good job of explaining for us sort of what you know, some of the genuine concerns are. But I mean, I often wonder if it's a means of, if the opposition to wokeness is an attempt to defend a status quo. And I'd be curious to hear what either of you have to say about that. And finally, another question to Nell might be, you know, earlier on you mentioned that you would not have signed the letter now because the whole kind of discourse about cancel culture has been co-opted by the right. And so I wonder, you know, in this moment when we have a new president in the White House, things are, I mean, that the cancel culture is still a refrain on the right. But I mean, how best to defend free expression without inadvertently bolstering right-wing agendas?
The short answer is, I don't know, because that's not my job. That's not what I do. But the longer answer is more in a case by case. And as you heard from my prepared remarks, I prefer to look at the larger question, the systemic questions, rather than anecdotal issues. So I suppose that's my question. So often there's no easy answer of where you slot yourself, whose company you like to be seen in. And so that is not now the company that I wish to be seen in, a company that speaks in terms of cancel culture.
Makes sense. And Thomas, maybe you might have thoughts on that as well before we open up for Q&A very briefly.
Sure, I think it's a very important thing to think through. In the letter, we never used the term cancel culture. And that was not a mistake, that was on purpose. Already a year ago, that term seemed to obscure some of the points we were trying to make more than it added light to them. It's kind of inescapable in talks like this or in regular conversation to completely avoid the term. It's very difficult, like it is to avoid the term wokeness, because it's kind of the shorthand that everybody has either agreed to use or has been forced to use. I was very troubled when someone like Donald Trump Jr., Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump started using the term, when Andrew Cuomo used it as a kind of get out of jail free card. It's very cynical.
Yeah.
And I think that actually it's not something that liberals can, my position, and I respect Nell's position, of course, but my position is that it's not something that we can simply concede to the right to care about or to co-opt or to misuse. It's something that actually I think liberals have to defend the right to speak about. And I think that for me, the reason why I do it is because I really do care about the actual racism in society. And I think that, you know, to be able to address these issues holistically and completely, you can't say for the sake of, you know, in some ways it's like what Marianne was saying, you don't want to add to the stigmatization of a group, or you don't want to give, you know, fuel to your opponents who are obviously operating out of bad faith. So you don't talk about certain things, but those problems don't simply go away by not talking about them.
Yeah.
So I try to fight for, you know, a liberal perspective on this, but it's certainly not easy. And, you know, one of the worst things that conservatives do is not call out the people that so cynically manipulate these things, like they manipulated family values and all types of conversations in the past.
With that, I think we are ready to open up for Q&A. Oh, sorry, Nell, would you like to, Marianne, would you like to add something?
Yes, I wanted to say something. I think it's possible to compare the United States and France in the way in which you have an instrumentalization, you know, of the question of the cancel culture, of the question of the laïcité by the right. But it's very important, I think, not to, how can I say that, you know, we are not going, for example, about of the laïcité to
Yes.
To give up with the laïcité because the right is misusing those questions. And about the cancel culture, I think it's very important. I am an historian, Nell is an historian, and for the historian, I think it's a nonsense, an absolute, you know, nonsense, because you can't, it's to fight against racism, it's better to not to hide, you know, discourses, text, caricature, but you have to explain it. You have to deconstruct this material, you know, and it's I think cancel culture is antinomic, you know, with the way in which historians work. I wanted to say.
No, thank you very much for bringing that up. In fact, I'm going to now open it up for the discussion for Q&A. And Marianne, we have a question for you, sort of along similar lines, if you don't mind, to kick us off. Sort of in keeping with what we were just saying, the question is, how? I'll get it. It's essentially how much do you think the defense of French universalism, the ideal, but also the reality in 2021, becomes a way for the kind of elites in power to protect their own position at the expense of criticism?
But, you know, I have to answer?
Yeah, I'd be curious, kind of in keeping with what you were just saying about how we have to fight for these values despite the reality that sometimes people cynically abuse the cause for their own ends?
The values of universalism and the values of anti-racism universalists are the values of the French Republic, which are liberté, égalité, fraternité. And I think that it's possible to use these values and in the name of universalism to ask for more equality, to ask for more social policies, you know. The strategies, the anti-racist strategies were different in the state and in the France, but I think that we can agree that the things are not going so fast that we should like, you know. And I think the better thing is now to confront, you know, those experiences, but not to say the concept of American anti-racism is better, but I think we have to il faudrait faire un bilan, you know. Et j'ai l'impression que les choses, sorry, but and my impression it does the things. We have difficulties in France with our system of representation, and you have difficulties in the United States with your system, with your culture of anti-racism, you know. And, and I think that the best way is to have social policies that are not sufficient, you know, with those population of the suburbs, with those population which are from the immigration. And the other point, very important, is education. And it's one of the purpose of the association that we have created with academics and teachers, you know. And I invite you to go on our site, Revue à l'Armée, because you will see how we can use this awful material, you know, for example, racist caricatures, etc., to deconstruct and to fight against racism.
Thank you very much for answering that admittedly very challenging question, but thank you very much. I know that you have given us much to chew on. Now, a question for Nell about let me just pull up the question. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem here finding it. Okay, a question for Nell, which is, in your earlier remarks, you mentioned the quote unquote crocodile tears of those who cry over cancel culture. What would you advise people to do when facing these types of people? Where to find a balance between educating them, which of course is not our job, or not talking to them at all? Sort of how to deal with those who claim cancellation.
I think it depends on who that person is. I don't think there's one answer for every situation. There's a different answer for a family member, for a faculty member or student, for policymakers. So I would say it's on a case-by-case basis. But the important thing is to realize simply that the slogan of freedom of speech simply should not automatically slap us into line. We need to grapple with it.
Yeah. Thomas, a question for you is the following. As a person of North Africa, this is from Karima Benouni. As a person of North African descent, much of what you say about the US misunderstandings of the problems of Islamism and Islamist terrorism resonates with me. And sorry, this is, I'm paraphrasing. The question is, why is there not more interest in actually listening to those in those North African and West African populations in France who take a critical perspective on the kind of dominant lines in their own communities. And, you mentioned earlier in your remarks, what do we think about the perspectives of minorities within minorities? And so I wonder if you could speak to that. So some of the most vocal opponents of Islamism and Islamist terrorism in France are actually, North African writers, and their views and voices make clear what you said. The issue is not just about ideology, but rather simply identity. So, I mean, just to return to your point, how do you feel that the minority within the minority voices are treated in the French debate, especially in the US?
Yeah, this is something that I think about quite a lot. And one of the first people, if not the first people I reached out to that I wanted to be a signatory to the letter was Kamel Daoud, who writes with a fatwa on his head from Oran in French, and is somebody whose bravery and courage I admire quite a bit, and who I don't think is actually held up as an example of an authentic voice of North African descent. And I've thought about why that is, and I think it's because part of the problem is well-meaning. It's the similar problem that I deal with, and that other people that I speak to sometimes deal with in their own careers as Black American quote unquote contrarians in the American racial discourse, is that white liberal gatekeepers decide what is an authentic Black story perspective, what is an authentic North African experience in France. And they basically say that, in America, that's Ta-Nehisi Coates' experience of Blackness. In France, that is a Muslim narrative that makes sense through the dynamic of oppression, which is supposed to be what the problem is that these identities are conflated with experiences of oppression, to be honest. And so anybody who deviates and says, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, or actually my identity doesn't mean that I think that beheading somebody over a cartoon that I disagree with, that has nothing, I have a different skin color than you in a different place of origin, but we can all agree that that's not a value I share. I think that these things get conflated in a kind of well-meaning paternalism that says white people have been very bad, and to be honest, all of the kind of harm in the modern world can be traced back to whiteness. And it oversimplifies so much complexity in the day-to-day lives of real people. So that's a very long way of saying that I think that we don't hear more from these people because their stories are not sought out. We need more stories, we need more speech, we need to hear from the kind of from the multiplicity of life experiences in each identity category.
I think, let me see if I can find more questions, and if not, I will ask some myself. We just have a few minutes left. Let me see.
While you're looking,
I think one big difference, now the last time I was in France was 2 years ago, so things may have changed. But one big difference be in the sort of public iconography, the public images of people. In the United States, it seems to me that it's much more multi, and I'm looking at commercial graphics, advertising, newspapers, but mostly advertising, because our advertising is so visual that that vision in the United States, as I encounter it, is much more multiracial and much more multicultural than what I encountered in France. And even though that's something that the state cannot get involved in, I think it makes a big difference in how people conceive of the society they live in.
So you mean sort of along the lines of just the branding, in a sense, like how things are presented in public, like who represents the culture, like the face of Marianne, for instance, or something like that.
No, that's still getting much more into sort of national identity. I mean,
the people who sell you stocks and bonds, the people who sell you rental housing, the people who sell you nonstick saucepans, the people who sell you cars. We live in a visual world full of probably actors, but people who speak to us. And in a country in which the people who speak to us are overwhelmingly white, and I should add young, it fosters a different sense of belonging to people who are just moving through the culture.
That's a really interesting point. And I guess sort of related to that, I'll ask one last question for maybe all of you to weigh in on a little bit. And maybe we could start with Marianne. So one of the things I think has been fascinating for all of us in these last few months is this sort of apparent divide between France and America. You know, we were told that it's these two models that are vastly different and that sort of are opposed in some respects and that kind of don't understand each other. But I wonder, I mean, how different are the models really? And are they so fundamentally opposed? Because on some level, I mean, the sister republics, so-called, do share a lot of values and a lot of commonalities, and also just basic assumptions about how a republic should work. And so I wonder, Marianne, if we could start with you. I mean, how different are France and America really on these fronts? Marianne? Okay, well, maybe
unmute. She needs to unmute.
Okay, Marianne, if you could unmute yourself, or maybe one of the others could weigh in before and we can come back to her. Oh, okay, great. Great.
So I think that we have a French motto, which is comparaison n'est pas raison. And I think it's impossible to equiparate the events in France and in the US because the two countries have, I try to insist about that, rather different, histories. But I'm sure that the values of the French Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité, are common values of our democracies, even they are different. We didn't speak about that, but for us French, for example, to have the motto "In God we trust" is something very strange, and here we can see that our cultures are really different. So I would say that the first aggiornamento to end with those misunderstandings would be about religion and laicity. American people should stop to consider with suspicion laicity, because laicity represents, for most French people, a conception of the relationship between the state and the society that guarantees the freedom for all. The laicité is not a war machine against the Muslim minority, as it was possible to read in some American newspaper. The laicité is born, we have to remember that, in the context of struggle against the power of the Catholic Church, which was allied of the monarchy under the Ancien Régime. And you can read a recent book of Patrick Weil about that. And I think it's important to remember the context in which appeared the laicity. So the laicity is a protection of the freedom of conscience. It protects the religions, but it protects from religion too. And it's true that on the extreme right, laicity is sometimes used as a tool for racism, but the problem is the extreme right. It's not the laicity, The second thing I would like to highlight, to say, is that rather than importing strategies or method of struggle born in specific contexts, it would be worthwhile to reflect on the failures on the respective model. And the third thing that seems very important to me is not to separate the struggles, not to contribute ourselves to forms of competition of memories or competition or victims that complicate the anti-racist struggle instead of consolidating it. This is also why it's important to me to reintroduce the question of anti-Semitism into the debate. You know, some of those new organization of the political anti-racism, wrongly called, of my opinion, politic anti-Semitism, is that they doesn't want nothing about anti-Semitism, you know.
That's
and
very important.
Finally, and I conclude for this reason, I think that the education, it is really important, and I invite you to publish and to contribute for our magazine online, you know, because our purpose is really to analyze and to struggle against all form of racism.
Great. Thank you so much. I will definitely be reading your magazine. And with that, I'm being told that we are out of time. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for having joined us today. I could be here for hours asking you all any number of questions, but unfortunately we only have a limited amount of time. So thank you all so much for participating and for engaging in this very fascinating debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you. Thank you.
Just some words of conclusion. Thank you very much to all our speakers for this true transatlantic debate. And I think it was a very fascinating conclusion to our 3 days festival, which purpose was to give different points of view about what is going on in France, what is going on in the United States, and to allow a better understanding between debates in both countries. So I think we did a good job from this perspective. And I want also to thank our colleagues from French Institute Alliance Française and La Maison Française at NYU. And just a few informations, the talks will be available online shortly, so the talks of all 3 days. And the performance by Tania de Montaigne will be available online, but only till the end of today. And of course, I invite all the attendees today to check our websites for future events. And I just want to highlight the event we will have on June 6th at the Cultural Services and at the Albertine bookstore with James Macaulay about his new book, The House of Fragile Things I mentioned before. Thank you to all of you, and hope to see you online for further events. Thank you.